Good evening, everybody. I'm Richard Dowden. I'm not an expert on Madagascar. I've only been there once. Although I've tried to cover the whole of Africa, it's one of those countries which I find so different to the rest of Africa that it really tends to be needed to be treated as a completely separate entity out on its own. And indeed, in the way that Africa is where we all come from and is so marked by humanity, it seems that Madagascar wasn't colonized by Homo sapiens until, I don't know, what are we talking, 3rd or 4th century, 5th century? We don't know quite when. But
the first millennium.
The first millennium. So it's human beings are quite new to this this island, although it is just vast. And if you visit it, the two things I came away with. One was that it is disappearing, because you fly over it and you see all around it in the sea. The sea is red with the earth of Madagascar as it's washed away into the sea by farming methods that erode the soil. And the other one, as Stephen was reminding me as we were chatting, is that the population is increasing at an incredible rate. Africa's population is going up quite rapidly. It doubles every generation. Madagascar's out in front. So where the population is going up, the actual island is going down. But it's been coming to the news recently because of the politics. And I'll start by asking Stephen, how did this coup happen? An extraordinary coup, a repeat of the coup that brought Marc Ravalomanana to power. Seems to have been done to himself by the mayor of Antananarivo. How did this come about?
Well, one big difference, and I'll just go back a little bit. Marc Ravalomanana was the mayor of Antananarivo. He stood for presidential elections in 2001, and the elections were rigged, but he successfully insisted that he had been duly elected, and in fact that was true. So eventually he prevailed in 2002. So Marc Ravalomanana actually came to power through the ballot box in highly contested fashion. The coup which happened last month was, of course, completely unconstitutional in the sense that there was no ballot of any sort. But the fact that twice in the space of less than 10 years, the mayor of the capital city has successfully become president through a more or less hotly contested process is very striking. I don't know if there's anything in this. I just read about Alan Sugar and Boris Johnson in the paper today. So, but I don't know if there's got any application to the United Kingdom. But really, the story is Marc Ravalomanana was elected president of Madagascar in 2002. He was re-elected and was deposed last month. Now, why was he deposed? What happened? Well, I think he made a number of mistakes. First of all, when Marc Ravalomanana became president of Madagascar, he was already one of the island's leading business people, and he carried on running his business interests as president. We've seen this elsewhere in the world, for example, with Prime Minister Berlusconi in Italy. It's not unheard of, but it is, it was very striking. So, of course, in those circumstances, when the president, makes a policy decision, you do tend to say to yourself, is this really in the national interest, or is it in the interests of his own businesses? I mean, among other things, he runs one of the country's leading supermarket chains, for example. He also treated the established political class with, I would say, contempt. So, which is not a good idea in the sense that it's one thing to displace a whole lot of established politicians, but if you treat them in that way, then, the opposition gets an extra edge to it. And one thing I would also like to point out, which was really the tipping point, I mean, he had a lot of politicians against him, a lot of business interests against him because of various established positions that he'd undermined and so on. Various people opposed to him on those grounds. He had a lot of the political elite against him, And then something happened last year, which is very closely connected with the British press, which is that the Financial Times revealed that he was negotiating with a South Korean company to rent a huge area of agricultural land to a foreign company for, you know, agro-industry. And this was revealed, and then he'd been having this negotiation completely behind closed doors. You know, the public was not aware of this. And when the news broke, it was adroitly used by the opposition to basically suggest that there was some sort of manipulation taking place. He was going to sell the land. So you got, for the first time, the political opposition got real popular roots, because, you know, the idea spread among many Malagasy people, say, what is going on here? Is he selling our country to foreigners, basically? And
was it business or was it politics? Was he doing this for Madagascar, or was he doing it for his own business interests?
Well, that's a good question. I mean, I, for one, and as far as I know, nobody else has ever really got to the bottom of this, because the crucial, you know, the negotiations were being done behind closed doors. I've never seen any documents which made clear exactly what was being said. Now, the former president's supporters and ministers were saying, no, this was a deal about foreign investment in Madagascar. It would have led to several $1 billion of the Korean investment. It would have created so many thousand, 70,000 jobs. You know, maybe this is all true, maybe, but of course, when it's negotiated in this way, then it's not altogether surprising that people take alarm. And if I may say so, this is not the only country in Africa in which currently big negotiations are taking place, mostly with Asian interests, about agro-industry. I mean, Saudi Arabia is investing a lot in Ethiopia, for example. This has it's a sign that if this sort of negotiation is mishandled, I mean, Richard, you know very well how in Africa, where still half the population are living on the land, I mean, people are very, very sensitive to the idea that somebody's going to take their land away from them. And if this is mishandled, not just, you know, in a way, what happened in Madagascar could be an awful warning to quite a few other East African countries, I would say.
There's Angola and the Chinese as well.
For example. There's
a deal going on there.
Yes, and I mean, I've just come back last week from China, and I met business people there and some government people, and talking about the kind of investments that are going on in Zambia, in Kenya, in Tanzania, Mozambique, and other places. Yeah.
But come back to the politics and tell us a little bit about Andry Rajoelina, and where he comes from. Well,
he's a young man, I think 34 years old at the moment. He's a businessman. He's made money by, he had controlling billboard hoardings, you know, advertising hoardings that you have by the roadside and so on. I mean, that was his thing. So, you know, he comes out of the advertising industry. He was also quite well known as a disc jockey. He was on the radio. So, but I mean, he's clearly a smart, enterprising, intelligent, ambitious young man. He became mayor of Antananarivo a couple of years ago and used that as a platform to oppose the president, and got backing from many of the older political elite whom Marc Ravalomanana had dispossessed, offended, treated with contempt, including notably a man called Roland Ratsirka, who's the nephew of the former president. He also upset the French, which is quite significant, for various reasons, partly because Marc Ravalomanana doesn't speak particularly good French. He doesn't, you know, he's not. He was not interested in keeping Madagascar. Madagascar, of course, is a former French colony. He really wants to take it out of that rather suffocating relationship with France. He was very open to the English-speaking world and to Asia. So specific French interests were being ignored. But I think it went much further than that. I mean, he handled very badly his relations with France, and it came to a climax with last year when he declared the new French ambassador persona non grata. And he did this on the 14th of July, which of course is Bastille Day. And the French...
Why?
Well, there were poor relations with France, and the new French ambassador was a man who'd previously served in Kinshasa and Côte d'Ivoire. And he'd been in the French ambassador in Kinshasa when the elder Kabila was murdered, and he'd been the ambassador in Côte d'Ivoire, where, as you know, in the sort of low-level civil war that's been going on in Côte d'Ivoire, particularly the supporters of President Gbagbo, I mean, they have this whole thing about French imperialism and so on. So the kind of rumour spread that this was a sort of French diplomatic hitman who'd been sent to Madagascar. Now, I'm sure that this is grossly unfair, but whether the government had grounds for thinking this or not, I think they clearly grossly mishandled it, because to declare a French ambassador persona non grata on Bastille Day is about the most offensive thing you can possibly do to the French Foreign Ministry, and they didn't replace him quickly. In fact, for 6 months there was no French ambassador, which was a distinct sign of French displeasure. And I think it's fair to say that in the dispute between Mr. Ravalomanana, the former president, and Mr. Rajoelina, the mayor of Antananarivo, who was getting demonstrators supporting him in the street and so on, the French were giving their support to Mr. Rajoelina, the contender.
How would they have done that?
Well, they did it by not sending an ambassador to replace their old ambassador, and they did it notably because from late December, early January, the mayor of Antananarivo, capitalising on popular discontent with, we have the economic crisis, like I'm saying, there was discontent because of the reports of this negotiation with a South Korean company about agro-industrial investment. And the mayor of Antananarivo was getting his supporters out on the street demonstrating. So there was a series of increasingly high energy demonstrations, more and more people. And then at a certain point, the police force reacted badly. Some people, they shot some people. And once people get shot, then of course this is getting really rather nasty. There was another case when some of these demonstrations were sometimes turning violent. There were people attacking shops, notably shops that were owned by President Ravalomanana, as he was, looting the shops. At one point, some people were looting a supermarket. Somehow or other, the supermarket got set on fire. They died in the fire. So these kind of things, it was getting very nasty. It reached a kind of climax in late January, February time, and then the steam started to go out of the demonstrations, and Rajoelina, Mr. Rajoelina, the former mayor of Antananarivo, disappeared, and he got asylum in the French embassy. So I think, there was a feeling that France had saved his bacon, as it were, at a time when he was losing the power struggle. Then in early March, mysteriously, somebody distributed, it is said, I mean, this is popular rumour, I can't confirm it, I didn't see it with my own eyes, I haven't seen an eyewitness account, but there was some sort of political intervention with the commanders of the military garrisons around Antananarivo, and a number of middle-ranking officers joined the opposition and basically launched a coup. They put Mr. Rajoelina in power. They seized the central bank, eventually attacked the presidency, forced Mr. Ravalomanana out of office. So really what we had was a coup, and the current president, Mr. Rajoelina, is not really the master in his own house. I think the real power is with that faction of the army, because the armed forces are clearly not united, which supports Rajoelina. But I mean, I know for a fact, and it's been said by the leaders of the armed forces themselves, there are still supporters of the former president in the armed forces.
So what you're saying is that it wasn't a coup, it wasn't a popular uprising that brought Rajoelina to power. It was actually a military coup, in that they didn't protect the president, and they may have actually helped Rajoelina come to power.
There was a mayor of Antananarivo who had a good deal of support in Antananarivo, a good deal of support from the sort of old political class, and various other constituencies. He was able to mobilize demonstrations in the streets of Antananarivo. So he had the support of, a part of the population of Antananarivo who were prepared to go out and demonstrate and, maybe even throw stones and attack a few shops and things like that. But what really put him in power was a military coup.
And how has this gone down? I mean, will they survive it? But coups are banned in Africa now. They cannot be recognized. They're not accepted. What's happened on the continent-wide front?
Well, internationally, nobody has accepted really the change of government. It was very important that it's clear that the contender, Mr. Rajoelina, had some support from the French Foreign Ministry. Now, I'm not trying to suggest that this was a coup orchestrated by France, because I have no reason to suggest that. All I'm suggesting is that in the power struggle between these two men, I think France had a degree of sympathy with Mr. Rajoelina. But immediately after the coup, President Sarkozy pronounced himself, in my opinion, very correctly. He said, no, this was a coup, and you know, this is clearly not a constitutional change of government, and this situation has to be rectified, you know, as soon as possible. And I think that was a very correct thing for him to say. So France, but also the United States, the African Union, importantly the Southern African Development Community, of which Madagascar is a member, nobody internationally has recognized the new government, and that's very important. So it's isolated internationally, and clearly I think it has very limited support in Madagascar. It has a support of part of the population of Antananarivo, but not the whole population, because the last few weeks there's been counter-demonstrations on behalf of the old president. It's supported by part of the army, but not the whole army. It's not clear how much support it has in the provinces of Madagascar, but I suspect not very much. And Mr. Ravalomanana is a leading lay figure. The old president is a leading layman in the Malagasy Protestant Church, which is a very powerful organization. So I suspect that many of the churches in Madagascar, which are very influential, would support the old president. So what it adds up to is, in my opinion, the former president probably has more support than the person, Mr. Rajoelina, who's the president and the head of state at the moment. But
being an island, you say it's isolated. Yeah. Islands are by nature isolated. Yeah. I mean, if this was other parts of Africa, the neighbours would be getting agitated. They might be beginning to interfere. It's quite difficult for the neighbours to interfere with Madagascar. So what pressure, other than international disapproval, which doesn't bring many guns or tanks with it, you know, how can things change?
Well, one of the positive aspects of the fact that it's an island is that there are not so many guns in circulation. I mean, if this was on the African continent, by this time, I'm sure that supporters of Mr. Ravalomanana and supporters of Mr. Rajoelina would be arming themselves, and we might have a very alarming situation. But there are not so many guns in Madagascar, fortunately. You're right. I mean, it has, you know, it is an island. But not only does foreign approval, or the lack thereof, have an effect, because of course it sends a very strong signal, but I mean, Madagascar is a very aid-dependent country. I mean, 70% of the state budget is foreign aid. So if the United States has said it will not provide any more foreign aid except for humanitarian purposes, and I believe Norway's done the same, and you know,
France?
I couldn't tell you exactly what the French position is. They certainly haven't cut off foreign aid. I don't think they've taken any sort of financial sanctions at all. But like I said, the President of France has made it clear that he regards this as an illegitimate change of government. So no, there are financial sanctions being applied to the current government, and in the current financial climate, that's serious. And for example, when I was in China last week, I was speaking to somebody from a kind of Chinese African Business Association, and he was describing one of his members who has a factory in Madagascar, a cement factory, and he was saying, well, you know, this is bad news, because the factory's unable to import some of the things it needs, and it's unable to bring its product to market in the normal way because of the disturbed political climate. So this is bad news all round for the economy.
And what would this is a bit of a test case for the Chinese then. They've got investments there. They do non-interference. They just deal with the government, however it came to power. What do you think they might do? What are their options?
Well, you know, Madagascar, as everybody knows, I mean, Africa and Madagascar, which is not really part of Africa, but I mean, it's part of the African Union, and it's become extremely important for China. Madagascar is an interesting place for China for various reasons. There has been some Chinese investment, including in the export processing zone, which has been quite a success in Madagascar. As you say, the Chinese government has a very strong point of saying, no, we support sovereign states. You know, we don't deal with internal politics. We just support sovereign governments. I'm not aware whether the Chinese are trying to put any pressure on anybody behind the scenes, but I'm sure that they will be hoping that Madagascar is able to decide who is its president and who is its government, and then they will be able to do business with that person and that government.
You didn't pick up in Beijing the trend that the Chinese are beginning to recognize that they do need to know what goes on under the surface in African politics, and they've got to take the plunge at some stage. I mean, not obviously very delicately and in a very restrained Chinese way, but they have got to, they can't just say, well, the government is the government and we deal with governments and that's it, and we don't interfere at all. I mean,
well, as you know, that is the official line.
Yeah.
You know, but I must say, I mean, with regard to Madagascar, I just don't know, because I haven't spoken to any Chinese official specifically about Madagascar. But I haven't really detected. I think that in that respect, it does appear that China really does try and do business at the moment with, you know, sovereign states as they are constituted. Now, as I think you're hinting, the moment must come when you know, some sort of rather unforeseen change of government takes place, and China might end up being quite embarrassed by finding that it's on the wrong side, or that it's perceived by the population of a country as having supported a group of people who are rather unpopular. I believe I'm right in saying that in regard to Sudan, which I was interested to see Chinese diplomats regard as a real success story for their development cooperation. I believe that China is actually cultivating quite a strong position with South Sudan. I mean, they really are talking to people in South Sudan, obviously in the expectation that there may be constitutional changes in Sudan in the future with the referendum in a couple of years' time.
What are the scenarios for Madagascar now? I mean, which way could it go? Could it end in a very nasty civil war? Could it go to a very nasty civil war? Is it more likely to be a deal? Will Ravalomanana come back?
The situation at present is that Marc Ravalomanana, the former president, is currently resident in southern Africa. I think he's in Swaziland, but I mean, he's in southern Africa. And he has, more than any other international grouping, he has the support of SADC, of the Southern African Development Community, of which South Africa, of course, is a leading member.
And Madagascar is a member.
Madagascar is also a member, yes. So he has that support, and he's currently resident in Southern Africa, and he has said he will go back to Madagascar shortly, in a couple of weeks, or a few weeks. There are every day, virtually, demonstrations in his support in Antananarivo. So the situation has now been changed around from what it was in January. In January, we had groups of people in the streets of Antananarivo calling for Marc Ravalomanana to go and for him to be replaced. We now have the reverse. Right? This is partly because Antananarivo is a socially extremely divided city. It's not necessarily the same people who've now changed round. It's that there are different. You know, it's a divided city, and it's been quite violent. I mean, there's been quite a lot of destruction in Antananarivo. You know, buildings burned down and so on. And there's been, since the beginning of January, a couple of hundred people killed, which by Malagasy standards is a lot. And all this in the capital city, so it's a very febrile atmosphere there at the moment. And as I said, the armed forces themselves are clearly divided. Mr. Ravalomanana has said he'll go back, and he's addressing these demonstrations sometimes by telephone. He's phoning, and it's being broadcast on loudspeakers to thousands of demonstrators who are there. And the government has said, well, if he comes back, we're going to arrest him for corruption and something else, I don't know, corruption. So we have to wait and see what happens. Now, the ideal thing, it seems to me, would be for there to be some sort of negotiation, because I think Mr. Rajoelina must recognise that I think that he can't hold on. He has said he will stay as head of state and he will organise elections in October 2010. But I don't think there's any way that he can hold on till October 2010. Of course, the worst case scenario would be a civil war. And I have to say that in 2002, when there were the disputed elections, there was in fact a low-level civil war, when President Ratsirika rigged the elections, refused to recognize that he'd been defeated. The country was divided. There was, you know, by international standards, this was not a severe war. There were a few hundred lives lost, but it got quite nasty. There were people blowing up bridges and cutting communications between Antananarivo and the provinces and so on. It was a low-level civil war. And
was this a more class-based war, or, as tends to happen in many African countries, an ethnic-based war? I mean, what do we know about outside the capital, or does, when it comes to politics, does only Antananarivo matter?
Well, I mean, obviously one of the lessons we can say from this is not the first time that we've seen national power being contested in the streets of Antananarivo, the capital city. The first time was in 1972, when Madagascar's first republic was overthrown really by urban protest movements that spread from Antananarivo to provincial towns. So that's what, 37 years ago, a long time ago. We saw similar clashes in the early 1980s, which took when the government, you know, as it were, organized the urban mob into a so-called, you know, youth organization, and they were confronted by various other groups in the capital. I mean, interestingly and rather perhaps surprisingly, by kung fu clubs, you know, by youngsters who were, you know, kung fu was very popular. They'd organized themselves into kung fu clubs, and the kung fu clubs became politicized, and they actually became bases for a certain anti-government policy. We saw things in the early 1990s with the democratization movement. So, you know, we have a whole history of power being fought over in the streets of Antananarivo. And I think provincial politicians have understood this, and that if you want to really contest a government, you have to mobilize people in the streets of Antananarivo. I have to say, and this is a very, very sensitive subject, but let me say it anyway because it's important for the understanding, that it's related to the fact that of the population of Antananarivo, a certain part of the population is of slave descent, and a certain part of the population is of free descent. Now, this is rarely talked about with foreigners. Slavery has been illegal since the beginning of the French colonial period, 1896. But, you know, in private, people are very conscious of this division. And by politically appealing to different strata of the population, this is one way of mobilizing people, but it's a very, very dangerous game. And that's what's been going on. Just in regard to the second part, the ethnic factor, of course, is there. And when I referred to this the sort of old political elite, a lot of these are what you might call provincial barons with power bases in the provinces based on patronage, and who nakedly and blatantly use ethnicity as a form of mobilization. But it only works up to a point, because Madagascar, after all, is a huge country, twice the size of Great Britain, a population of 20 million people, but they all speak the same language. So ethnicity has a certain sort of traction, but it's limited.
But it is ethnic. I mean, it's not just regional. It's, I don't know how you get
it's ethnic, but I mean, for example,
yeah.
Mr. Rajoelina and Mr. Ravalomanana are both of the same ethnic origin. Right. So, in fact, one of the interesting things about now is this contest, for the time being, is not an ethnic contest compared to certain previous. But I have to say, I know this is a sort of an old chestnut, but I am, after all, a historian, and I've just written this history of Madagascar. But the ethnicity as we know it, you know, in Malagasy politics, is really a creation of the 20th century. I mean, there are ethnic groups in Madagascar. You can find their names in 17th century documents, so we can say that in some sense these ethnic groups have existed for 300 or 400 years. But as a sort of, you know, a tool of modern political mobilization, it's really a creation of the late colonial period and of the nationalist period.
And just before I'd love to open this up to questions and so on, but just remind us what Madagascar gives the world. I mean, what's it got that the rest of us want? Well, what does it trade in?
Well, I mean, in colonial times, as in so many European colonies, there was tropical crops were cultivated. You know, coffee, vanilla, cloves, bit of rubber, and so on, and sold to metropolitan markets, and that, you know, so those were the cash crops, and that was it. Since the end of the colonial period, and particularly since the 1972 revolution, I mean, a lot of those cash crops have declined for various reasons. I think I'm right in saying that Madagascar is still the world's leading producer of cloves, but as if any of you have got a little jar in your kitchen that you've had for the last 10 years and you've only ever used 2 or 3 cloves out of the jar, you know, it's not a product that's in great demand worldwide. So it's not been exporting very much. Tourism has really come up in recent years. When I lived in Madagascar in the late 70s and early 1980s, there were very, very few tourists, which was not surprising because it was closely aligned to North Korea and it was very hard to get a visa. But I mean, tourism has really come, particularly eco-tourism. I think last year or the year before last, I read the figure, I think there were 400,000 tourists. I mean, that's a considerable number. So tourism had really come up. And Mr. Ravalomanana, being a businessman, being very, you know, pro-free market, very pro-American, he was a favorite of the Bush administration. You can imagine he was a born-again Christian, he was a businessman, and he didn't like the French. Yeah. They thought, ooh, it was pretty good. And he did encourage foreign investment. So we've had Rio Tinto with a very big investment in the south of Madagascar. There are oil fields in Madagascar, but it's shale oil, Bemulanga oil field. It's you know, it's an expensive process. It's not oil like we have in Saudi Arabia. So, but I mean, there is a beginning. And Mr. Ravalomanana, when he was president, was opening the country up to a lot of foreign investment quite successfully. There was still is a successful export processing zone, which was actually begun in the 1980s, you know, making textiles with Chinese capital, Mauritian capital, and that was pretty successful. So, you know, there have been signs that it was on the verge of some sort of, you know, agricultural, industrial transformation. The economic growth rates were high the last few years, but the coup will have really put the dampers on that, I think.
Okay. Right, Stephen, thank you very much. But you're not going to you're going to ask some questions from other people now. Who would like to ask Stephen? Yes, Richard. Could you just identify yourself?
Yeah, Richard Jolly. Thanks very much. I wonder, wonder whether you could say why Marc Ravalomanana didn't seem to resist longer than he did, particularly if he did seem to have quite a lot of support, as you said, in different parts of the country. And while you're at it, you said some have been mobilizing the slaves. Which of the two, or have both of them been? Thank you.
Well, on the first part, I think it's clear that over the years Madagascar has become so centralized that if a president is really contested in the streets of Antananarivo, then the fact that you may have majority support in the rest of the country doesn't count for very much. And I think that's what he's been confronted with. And I have to say that over many decades, we've seen this phenomenon of governments which appear to have overwhelming support measured by votes, nevertheless being rather weak when it comes to this sort of contestation. So, for example, in the First Republic, which was overthrown in 1972, just shortly before, you know, the president had been getting like 90% votes. Now, and this was not just because of rigging. I mean, the point I'm making is that, particularly in the rural areas, people tend to vote for whoever the government is, for reasons that are partly ideological and partly just purely pragmatic. You know, it's better the devil you know than the devil you don't know. So every government in Madagascar is particularly vulnerable to movements in the streets of Antananarivo, which has just been shown. On the second point, I mean, let me not be misunderstood. There has been no slavery in Madagascar since 1896. And it's a very sensitive subject, which I try and discuss as delicately as I can, and even to kind of evoke it can cause strong feelings. But there is definitely a feeling in Antananarivo that the population is divided into those who are descendants of slaves and those who are descendants of former free groups. And Mr. Rajoelina, who himself is from a free, as it were, caste, as it were, you have sort of quasi-caste system in Madagascar, nevertheless managed to mobilize the city poor, many of whom are descendants of slaves. and they have, as you might imagine, particular problems of unemployment, poverty, and so on. And I think Mr. Ravalomanana would probably have more support among other sections of the population. And I don't wish to say, you know, it's not as simple as saying the one are on one side and the others on the other, but it is an element in the politics of the urban mob, which is what we're talking about.
Okay. Yes, there's a question at the back there.
David Bruin. I'm a little bit intrigued that of all the countries in Africa he could have chosen to go to in his exile, temporary or permanent, and he chose Swaziland. Could it have been because King Mswati is the chairman of the very important political committee of SADC?
I think that
he wanted to be where the influence was.
Well, I think that's exactly correct. It's not clear to me whether Mr. Ravalomanana is actually spending all his time in Swaziland or whether it was somewhere else. He was on very good terms with the, well, I suppose still the President of South Africa, Mr. Motlanthe. I don't know if his relationship with Mr. Zuma is so close. I don't think it is. But I think what you just said is absolutely correct, yes.
Yeah.
Hi, Joe Boyd. Just, you've kind of talked about slavery and non-slave legacies without mentioning any ethnic connection, but would it be a reasonable assumption that the descendants of slaves are more the African descendants and the free population is more the Asian descended?
Well, there's a long history in Madagascar whereby successive generations of historians and anthropologists for the last 150 years have tried to identify certain geographical or ethnic groups and to say, because it's all part of the great historical question of where did the Malagasy come from? You know, did they come from Africa? Did they come from Asia? Did they come from somewhere else? Which I attempt to go over the stuff in the book which I've written with Sulufu Randrians. And it's pretty clear that the history of Madagascar is sufficiently complex, and there's been so many centuries of immigration and then migration within the island that it's not convincing to say that any specific group of people, you know, came from Indonesia and this group came from Mozambique or something like that. However, you only have to go to the island and you can see that there are differences. I mean, on the west coast, which of course is just opposite Mozambique, you know, people are much darker skinned, they tend to have curly hair, their music is much more obviously African influenced, and so on. The people in the highlands, particularly the higher castes, Andrine and Houve, tend to be lighter skinned, and yes, skin colour and above all the quality of hair are markers of status. It's quite true. But you do find high caste people who are quite dark skinned, so it's not absolute. But
and are you implying that there's a theory that the lighter skinned people whose musical heritage is obviously Indonesian or seems to be Indonesian could be from somewhere else?
No, I'm just saying that over the historical, well, let me start at the beginning. The Malagasy language is part of the Austronesian language group. It's the most westernmost outpost of a language family which extends over, you know, modern Indonesia, the Philippines, and the Pacific. And the westernmost outpoint is Madagascar. So quite clearly, if only on linguistic grounds, we can see that at a crucial period of its early history, Madagascar was very strongly influenced by people coming from the islands of what is now Indonesia. It's also both obvious from people's physical characteristics, from their culture, from the archaeological record, and from the time that we have reasonably good documentation, which is to say from the 16th century, it's also clear that there were regular patterns of immigration from Africa, of course, and in fact people were coming from Africa even before then, as can be shown, but also from the Middle East and elsewhere. So, but the point I'm making is just that it's been a sufficiently complex process which has gone on for such a long period of time that people have become so mixed in all ways that it's extremely hazardous, if not to say misleading, to get some cultural element such as musical style, a few elements of dialect, clothing, certain types of technical skill like how people build boats, for example, and say, aha. I mean, if you look at the older anthropological literature, it's full of cases where some missionary or French soldier has stumbled upon a group of people making a boat, and he said, I saw people doing that in Indonesia. You know, this proves that this group of people came from such and such a place. And it turns out it's just not that simple. But yes, I mean, there are correlations, but it's very hazardous to say this specific group came from this specific point in Africa or Indonesia or so on.
Presumably this can all be settled by DNA, though.
Well, there has been DNA research which reveals pretty much what you'd expect, which is that the Malagasy are sort of partly of Asian origin and partly of African origin, which is exactly what we all knew from the start, you know.
Okay.
Michael. Does the Malagasy diaspora in France have much influence on domestic politics?
It's a difficult one. I think these days, I mean, it's interesting, there have been, over the years, quite big Malagasy diasporas, because in the past, Madagascar was not a leading, but nevertheless a significant centre for the slave trade. So in the 19th century, and then various other forms of emigration, so in the 19th century there were groups of people speaking Malagasy in Cape Town, in Réunion, in Mauritius, and Malagasy were even taken as slaves to the United States in significant numbers in the early 18th century, amazingly, because it's such a long way. But of course, in modern times, as Michael Dwyer is suggesting, I mean, the significant Malagasy diaspora is in France, because that was the colonial power, and therefore they have the ability to influence policy and so on. I don't think that the Malagasy diaspora has significant influence on the French government, but they do if you start reading internet debates. Of course, there's all sorts of contributions by Malagasy living in France, and these days in the United States as well. And I don't think it has a huge impact on Madagascar itself, but it might have some impact on external perceptions, I guess.
Hi, I'm Kate Short. Firstly, please would you expand on the Chinese's interest in minerals, particularly in oil, in Madagascar? And secondly, forgive my ignorance, but you mentioned earlier about Saudi Arabia and the oil extraction process. That's sort of easier in Saudi Arabia. And how is that different in Madagascar? And how would that differ to the Chinese interest in, for example, in DRC, in Africa and other countries where, you know, it's hugely rich in minerals? Thanks.
Okay, well, I'm no sort of expert on oil, and there's bound to be somebody here who knows more about oil than I do, but my understanding is as follows. China, like any other country, you know, industrial country, is very concerned to have secure supplies of oil. In the case of China, there's clearly a great interest in Africa, and China's now getting, I think, about 30% of its oil imports from Africa, with Angola in the first place, if I'm not wrong. Madagascar it's been known for 20 or more, 25, 30 years, it's been known that Madagascar has quite large oil shale deposits. But this is oil in a particular form, and again, forgive me, I'm not an oil expert. I mean, I probably wouldn't know an oil shale from I don't know what, but I mean, it's very difficult to extract the oil from that. It's not a classic oil well. However, modern technology means that it's now relatively easier to extract oil from oil shale. So these Malagasy deposits, which have been known about for a long time, but have never been really viable commercially, now are viable. And if I'm not wrong, I think the rights are at the moment with Total. As far as I'm aware, China has not been significantly interested in Madagascar as a source of oil, but of various other things, including the export processing zone, as a, you know, as a place for where Chinese companies can manufacture textiles. One of the things that really struck me was in China just last week was that whereas I'd read in the paper quite a lot about China, and you always hear about the Chinese government this and the Chinese government that, and it is after all a communist country, so the government can decide a lot, but what really struck me was how much of the Chinese push into Africa is coming from the private sector. And Chinese government officials told me, well, we don't really know what's going on because we don't control these guys. And so much of it is, and I think this is the case with Madagascar. As far as I'm aware, the Chinese government does not have a major interest in Madagascar. They're much more interested in Angola, Kenya, Congo, Sudan, of course. But the Chinese private sector is quite interested. You know, we're talking about relatively small companies who might be just doing things like manufacturing textiles, anything else, and they see a commercial opportunity.
Or provincial-backed companies.
Or they might be backed by a provincial government.
Out of control of Beijing.
Which is also slightly out of control because, you know, obviously, you know, a large Chinese province is the size of a very big country. I mean, you know, I think, was it Jiangxi, where, you know, it's like 100 million people or something. So, and the provincial governments have their own industrial and their own foreign policy, in a sense, at least their own foreign commercial policy.
So the fact that these, for example, Xinjiang and further south...
You wait for Mark.
I mean, obviously China is an enormous country, and as we all know, that Beijing has often very little control over far west, Xinjiang and Gansu in the southwest, where it's very poor. But how would you say, is it Richard, how would you, I mean, how does this control exercise itself in Madagascar and in other countries in Africa?
Well, I can't speak for Madagascar, but in other countries, that they've essentially said to the Chinese government has said to its business, go out and get. There is, what is it, $3 trillion they've got to spend, and they will use their aid. You know, you want a road, you want a presidential palace, you want a stadium, fine, and you sign up for the oil. And none of these deals are very transparent. We haven't seen very many of them, but they are spending huge amounts of money in Africa in order to secure oil and other important minerals, and now it looks like food, because they only have something like 7% arable land in China, and they're going to need food, and they're looking for that as well. And in the wake of that, vast numbers of Chinese people have come to Africa, and many of them stay on. And interestingly, the ambassador to South Africa, somebody was speaking to the Chinese ambassador to South Africa, said, what's your biggest headache? And he said illegal immigrants, Chinese immigrants, coming to South Africa. It's because there have been horror stories, or scare stories, I say, about, you know, the Chinese actually coming and physically taking over, colonizing Africa. And the question was, is this Chinese policy? And it seems definitely not to be, because they realize the political dangers of this, and yet they can do very little about it. I mean, if Chinese just up sticks and go and arrive somewhere, they don't know they're there any more than the government does.
Yeah, no, that's right. But in the case of Madagascar, all I'm saying is, as far as I'm aware, the Chinese government doesn't regard Madagascar as particularly important. You know, it's not identified it as a vital source of some raw material. However, it is of certain interest to the Chinese private sector. There is a small Chinese population in Madagascar which has been there for the last, 100 years. I mean, the French brought in Chinese labourers to work on the railway, and some others came. So, when Chinese people go there, they can find people, who've been there for 2 or 3 generations. So it has a certain attraction for Chinese, I think mostly private sector business, but I don't think it's a place where the Chinese government sees it as a great asset for the future.
Okay.
Sabina Machanara. I just wanted you mentioned that you don't see Rajoelina, sorry for my pronunciation, holding on until October 2010.
No.
Do you see him trying to push through constitutional amendments, for example, to the age of a presidential candidate can be, in the next, in the short term, before he agrees to negotiations?
Well, I mean, this is referring to the fact that he's 34 years old, and the current constitution says the president must be at least 40, so he has a problem. But I mean, clearly he has said, and he's been urged by several people, including the President of France, to say, no, you must regularize your position. You know, you've taken power illegitimately. That's true. And he said, yes, okay, well, we'll have to hold an election, and it means changing the constitution. So clearly that's what he would like to do, is to stay in power for at least the next year and a half, which will then be long enough for him to make those changes and to hold an election, and he would hope win the election. And all I'm suggesting is that I don't think he will stay there that long. Something will happen before then. He may still be head of state, but I don't think the process is going to be that smooth.
Do you think the current protests will see his popular support topple or decrease, and his military backing as well, and that perhaps there's going to be further military interference against him?
It's very hard for anybody, but particularly from the distance that we are from Madagascar, it's very hard to be sure. But my impression is that, you know, he clearly still has some support among the population of Antananarivo. The people who were demonstrating for him in January and February this year, you know, they still have some support for him. Of course, if he doesn't do something for them, jobs or whatever, then they're going to probably get a bit disillusioned. He has clearly considerable support in the army, and some army middle-ranking officers have now got key jobs. You know, we now have a colonel who's become defense minister, things like that. He has the support of some of the provincial kind of political barons, people like Roland Ratsirke, who I mentioned, who's the nephew of a former president, former mayor of Tamatave, and he's clearly one of the main orchestrators of support for Mr. Rajoelina. And apart from that, it's very hard for me, certainly from this distance, to know, and you know, there's so little information coming out of the provinces, it's very hard to know, you know, what people in any given part of the country may be thinking. But as far as I can see, what it all adds up to is I don't think he has much support countrywide as Mr. Ravalomanana. So, but Mr. Ravalomanana no longer lives in Madagascar. He's living in, as far as we know, Swaziland, or somewhere in southern Africa. So what's going to happen? Nobody knows. I don't know. But the situation at the moment is not stable. I don't think Mr. Rajoelina can stabilise the situation and then eventually hold elections in October 2010. I don't think it'll get that far. What will happen, I really can't tell you, but it seems to me that very, very crudely, either there's going to be some sort of political negotiation which will lead to an agreement between these two people and some sort of patched up political solution, or there's going to be a more intense and probably more violent power struggle of some sort, which of course is the thing that, well, most people would least want.
Is there a civil society? I mean, this thing we call civil society, and God, if somebody said define it, I don't think I could, but it's sort of journalists and churches and NGOs and people. I mean, they've provided a sort of buffer in parts of Africa towards against a very rough edges of government. Are they? Are they important? And is Parliament important here?
No, I mean, I'm afraid successive Malagasy parliaments have been pretty useless. I mean, they've either been used as a rubber stamp or they've been just self-interested, you know, very corrupt.
Are these the barons that you were talking about?
No, partly, but I would say the barons are more people who have important regional fiefs. So, you know, they may be the mayor of somewhere, or they may have had some, they could have been a parliamentarian, but the point is they have control of a patronage network at some local level or other in the country. That's the key thing. And they often maintain it, indeed, through some sort of ethnic appeal. So that on the, you know, I mean, a case that I know of, for example, on the East Coast, you have a group called the Betsi Masark. You have in the past had and that's in the area around Tamatave, the main port on the East Coast. And in the past, you know, you've had some sort of political intellectuals, as it were, who will go to extreme lengths to say, no, but Betsi Masark is a kind of separate people, and you know, you're familiar with the phenomenon. You say, we are all one. Vote for me. I am your leader. You know, and this is, of course, historically, this doesn't make sense at all. But I mean, there is that that element. But I don't think the ethnic element is particularly strong, and I think it's declining, but it can be politically massaged and it can become very dangerous. But I don't think it's a big thing right now.
Okay. All right. Yeah.
Catherine Williams. You mentioned the Ravalomanana's rise to power in 2001-2002 against Didier Ratsiraka and so on. And as I understand it, one of the explosive events of the current crisis was an interview with Ratsiraka that was broadcast on Radio Viva, Rajoelina's radio station in, I think, November last year.
Yeah.
Could you comment at all on whether you think Didier Ratsiraka and Arima have any part in the current conflict, or whether they really are dépassés?
I should just say that Didier Ratsiraka was a naval officer who came to power in 1975 and then was president. Was defeated, then came back again and was president for a second spell. And he was the dominant figure, really, from 1975 till 2002. I think he's now living in Paris. He certainly left in 2002 when Marc Ravalomanana came to power. He's in poor health. I mean, even when he left power, his eyesight was failing. And I think by this time, his eyesight is probably really rather poor. I've often wondered and asked people about his role, and he must be taking an interest because, you know, he's the sort of Machiavellian, he's got all the experience, he knows all the connections, he knows which strings to pull. But I think the person who's playing that role of the sort of coordinator of the political opposition is in fact his nephew, Roland Ratsiraka, who of course is younger, is as far as I know in good health, who's the former mayor of Tamatave. How closely he consorts with his uncle in Paris, I think he's living in Paris at the moment, I don't know. But I would imagine that there is some communication. But as far as I know, I don't think, I think the elder Ratsiraka is really now a bit passé, and I think Roland Ratsiraka is the man to watch.
How closely does he follow his uncle's policies, and is Arima still an active force in Malagasy politics?
I don't think Arima's a very active force in Malagasy politics. I mean, Arima was a party formed by President Ratsiraka. After he'd become president, it was a sort of presidential party in a way that we're fairly familiar with. And indeed, Mr. Ravalomanana did something very similar when he was campaigning for president the first time. He created a party called Tim Tiakui Madagascar, which means I love Madagascar. And that party seems to have now disintegrated. I mean, it was very much a presidential party. Interestingly, his main support now is coming from a party called the MFM, which was an extreme left-wing party which was set up in the 1970s and then moved steadily became steadily more right-wing. Mr. Ravalomanana has now said that, you know, he still regards himself as president because he was duly elected. He's named a prime minister, Rakutniri Manandafi, who's the historic leader of the MFM party. So that's quite interesting because now politically he's now very dependent on the MFM party, which remains a coherent party and has the support of it has quite a lot of support from the middle class, particularly in the region around Antananarivo. So in regard to your question, I think as far as I can see, well, Arima actually formally was disbanded some years ago and was replaced by a party with another name, but I think as a unit it's pretty much ceased to be coherent. And in terms of ideology, well, I don't think either the elder or the younger Ratsiraka really has an ideology, in the sense that Didier Ratsiraka, when he was president, was a strong socialist. I mean, he was aligned with the Soviet bloc and with North Korea, and he had all these slogans about, you know, he had a very left-wing program, which he was obliged to abandon in the early 1980s, and he did a deal with the IMF, and then he became a fervent liberal. But I mean, really, his all through his period in power, and I think the same is now being picked up by his nephew Roland Ratsiraka. The red thread is the appreciation that there is a good deal of power in the provinces, and that by programs of decentralization. At one stage, he even had a project for a federal constitution, and by the rhetoric of ethnicity and regionalism, that is what he always used, and in a way, that's what's at stake in the current struggle. And it's one of the great mistakes that Marc Ravalomanana made, in my view, when he was president, which was to centralize power and to really just sort of disregard all these regional and ethnic sensibilities. Because it's one thing to say, I don't care about ethnicity. That's, in many ways, that's quite helpful. But it's another thing to kind of completely disregard and to treat with some contempt all kinds of regional sensibilities and interests and so on. And he clearly, that's one of the things that's provoked opposition to him.
Okay. We've got a question at the front here.
Thank you. First, if I may just add something to what you were saying about slaves.
Could you just give us your name?
Yes, sorry, Peter Metcalf. First, just to add something to what you were saying about slaves, based on having lived in Madagascar, that it's not at all a sort of straight racial division. And in Tananarive, you can meet people who, have a certain level of educated and so on, and then you are told afterwards that they are the descendants of slaves, but they may look like other members of the elite. And you could say in a kind of soundbite that not all blacks are slaves, which is true because there are free blacks on the plateau, and not all slaves are black. Anyway, I just wanted to add that to what you were saying about slaves. On the question I wanted to ask was really very much in line with the question that's just been asked about the influence of Ratsirak in Paris and the other members of his former government. Because I think at the beginning of the troubles, the coup, a lot of people assumed that Rajoelina was very much supported from by that group in Paris, Ratsirak. And it was assumed that, and he at one point said that the former refugees could come back, or the former people who had been banned from coming back, and Ratsirak himself expected to come back at some point. But then he suddenly said he didn't want them to come back to Independence Day, the 26th of June. And Pierrot Rajoelina, the former Minister of Finance and ambassador in Washington and so on, has sort of broken that ban and came back last Saturday. And I think at an international level or at a government level, he has perhaps much more credibility than Roland Ratsirak, whose base has always been much more regional. Yeah. So I wondered if you had any comment on Pierrot's return, and whether you think that we might be seeing a real third force coming in here, not third force in the Tony Blair sense. Yeah. I don't know whether you have any comments on that.
Well, first of all, absolutely correct on the issue about the slavery, and I certainly didn't want to imply that there's either, as you absolutely say, you can't always tell whether of what descent somebody is. But Malagasy people know, and it is a factor. There's no doubt about it. It's a factor in social life, and it's a factor in political life. This may be so in many countries which have once in their history been slaveholding societies, but in Madagascar it's more than that, because this is also a society which is very fundamentally has sort of quasi-castes. And as I think we show in the book, this seems to have been present in Madagascar. It's from the very time that Madagascar was first settled by human beings, coming from, many of whom came from Southeast Asia, there was an idea originally of Hindu origin that people come in existentially different sorts. So it's a kind of quasi-caste system, which plays with the question of whether somebody is of slave origins or not. Indeed, I get the impression that Mr. Rajoelina, indeed, he has a number of former politicians, some of whom you might regard as more credible than others, in his entourage, and many of them, I think, would like to be president themselves. And this is a problem that he has. That's another of the reasons why he's essentially, I think, rather weak. And you've named the former Prime Minister, who has now come back. I think he's Minister of Finance. Sorry, Minister of Finance who's now come back. And he's clearly a credible figure. And I think this complicates matters still more. Yes, I agree with you. And I think there's Roland Ratsirak himself, I think, has clearly got ambitions of his own. So it's not that Mr. Rajoelina has a coherent group behind him. I think far from that.
Hi, Kat Lewis. How would you characterise the level of censorship within Madagascar? Like, are journalists able to speak freely? Do people know what is going on completely?
Well, that's very difficult for me to say. Certainly for since the 1990s, I mean, there was a democratization movement, as in so many parts of the world and in so many parts of continental Africa, in the early 1990s. And since then, there's been a number of newspapers and radio stations and television stations, and there's a variety of political opinion. It's quite clear that we don't have complete freedom of opinion, because indeed, as one of the other speakers, so I think the lady said, one of the issues has been about private radio stations with political connections, carrying interviews that the government regards as embarrassing, and then there's attempts made to shut them down. And this was one of the issues which gave rise in November last year to the kind of the immediate reason for the crisis. And just recently there's been attempts to shut down some radio stations. So clearly we don't have complete freedom of the media. How difficult it is for journalists in their day-to-day work, I mean, whether they stand a risk of being beaten up or worse, I really don't know. I mean, you don't have complete freedom of information, but in practice, I find it impossible to say. I'm sorry.
Hi there. My name is Kissy Ajimantogovo. Just last week, I read that some international organizations on the ground in Madagascar described the situation as catastrophic. That was because, obviously, of the political situation, but also because of the fact that, Madagascar has been prone to a number of cyclones and tropical storms. We also have a situation whereby, because of the unrest, agricultural production has slowed, and so exports have not been as much as normal. Obviously, the tourism sector has been, quite severely affected by the situation. I just wanted to know what your opinion was on that, whether it was too much of a pessimistic outlook for the country. And on a separate issue, I also read somewhere that the EU envoy to Madagascar said that, the EU has halted some sort of financial assistance towards Madagascar, and when the EU envoy to Madagascar was quizzed on this, he was keen to say that it was not at all to do with the political situation of present, but rather it was because of mismanagement by Ravalomanana when he was in power. And I just wanted to know what your views were on this, why it is that the EU has not been extremely vocal like other international bodies or organizations with regards to the situation in Madagascar.
Well, I mean, there's two questions there. The first one, how bad is it? Well, first of all, it's very, again, from this distance, it's very hard to say, because there's not very much information coming out from the provinces in particular, so it's very hard to know what the situation is on the ground in any particular part of Madagascar. But clearly, I mean, this is not a good situation. As you said, I mean, it's disastrous for tourism. It disrupts commerce generally. The fact that some leading foreign donors, notably the United States, are more or less suspending aid, except for humanitarian aid. I mean, this is all bad news economically in a country that's already one of the poorest countries in the world. So, I mean, all of this has to be bad news. It seems to me that, over and beyond that, looking back, Madagascar has really been politically unstable since 1972, since the overthrow of the First Republic. And, you get periods of relative stability. Ratsirika was a kind of successful, he was very good at playing people off against each other and so on, so he was in power for a long time. But, it's always been unstable. And when Marc Ravalomanana came to power in 2002 and was then re-elected, it really seemed that Madagascar was coming out of that period, and that, you know, you were going to get into a period of, you know, governments being constitutionally elected, and that this, and since he was so keen on encouraging foreign investment and so on, indeed the growth rate was rising, there was foreign investment going in, then from a political point of view it looked quite hopeful. Now that also is now, you know, we're back to square one in terms of political stability, and I think that's very depressing. With the European Union, of course, there were a lot of people who criticised Marc Ravalomanana because, to put it, you know, kindly, it wasn't always clear whether he was doing things that were good for the country or that were good for his personal businesses and those of his friends. And then there were a few sort of gratuitous things, like when he bought, you know, he bought a presidential jet. This is a small, you know, I'm sure he could justify it by saying, yes, but I need one because everybody else has got one and I have to travel a lot and so on. But, you know, in such a poor country, and he's a wealthy man anyway, he probably could have bought his own private jet with his own private money without getting the state to buy it for him. But, you know, these things were you know, he made some huge mistakes. And gave all sorts of ammunition to the opposition to do what they did. With regard to the European Union, well, of course, notoriously, the European Union, when it comes to Africa in particular, tends to take the line of those of its leading members who feel very strongly on a subject. So, you know, I don't know, if it's a question of relations with Zimbabwe, then Great Britain, the United Kingdom, would tend to have a very leading role within the European Union. When it comes to Madagascar, it's France. But generally speaking, I mean, after all, there's a number of international organisations who've pronounced, apart from sovereign states like the United States, you know, we have the European Union, we have the African Union, we have the Organisation of the Francophone Countries, La Francophonie, we have the Southern African Development Community, and they've all, we have the United Nations, of course. They've all taken slightly different lines. The one that's gone furthest is SADC, to say we just, you know, we reject this change of government. But everybody else is saying we urge the most rapid possible normalisation, or words to that effect. So the European Union is pretty much in line with most other international organisations.
Incidentally, I think it was in 2005 when Britain was desperately trying to help Africa. It closed the embassy in Madagascar, and you could do worse than write to the Foreign Secretary and ask for it to be restored, because I think that was a terrible mistake. Yes?
Not the first time either, they did it before, yeah.
I know that there are large, at least significant amounts of illegal mining going on in Madagascar, and there are airstrips taking minerals out, you know, in the south of the country, and I believe, I remember reading that it's Korea and Japan and such Oriental economies that are involved in this. Is that, I mean, is one of these groups or another more allied with pirate mines, supportive of their, you know, being paid off by, I mean, is that a factor in this?
Well, I should say, first of all, Madagascar being an island, you know, like Australia, which originally was part of another continent and then broke off millions and millions of years ago, it's a sort of, I mean, of course, that's the reason why its wildlife is so interesting for zoologists, because, you know, you've got species there that you don't find anywhere else, and the flora and fauna. And also, geologically, it's rather an unusual place. So the reason I say that is Madagascar has large reserves of various semi-precious stones. You know, they don't have diamonds. They do have large amount, you know, they have sapphires, they have all kinds of, I think they have amethysts, all kinds of stuff which I wouldn't really know what they are, but I mean, it's valuable. There is indeed a great deal of wildcat mining. There's a particular site in the centre-south of the country, which I've never personally visited, where I think it's sapphires that are interesting there, but a kind of boom town grew up there in a couple of years, and I think it's now got 300,000 or 400,000 people, and it really sounds like the Klondike in the 19th century. You know, I mean, the people have come from all over Madagascar to work there. You know, like the pictures you see of diamond mining in Africa. You know, artisanal mining with pickaxes and shovels, and you get traders coming from all over the world. I think particularly Thailand, but also and other parts of Southeast Asia, but also Americans and Europeans, and certainly until recently, the police had no grip on this place. You know, it really was the wild, well, in this case, the wild South, but you know, the Wild West, and I remember, you know, in being in places in Antananarivo where various gem dealers who are obviously of foreign origin, I mean Africans, a lot of Congolese, Malians, Senegalese, but also various Southeast Asians and various other, you know, Europeans and so on. You know, they were trading gems. There were people coming in, and I was watching in the foyer of a hotel where I was staying, not a particularly salubrious hotel, but still there were people trading these things, and you know, there's obviously big business. In answer to your question, I really don't know whether one or the other candidate tends to have control of wildcat gem mining. I just don't know. But it's part of the importance of these regional barons, because of course, you know, if you've got a regional strongman, that's exactly the sort of thing he would have under his control. But in this particular case, I just don't know.
Yeah, the question there, and I think this is going to have to be the last one.
Yeah, Ilocos is definitely the scariest place I've ever been in Madagascar.
Yeah.
I think really that's probably the greatest tragedy of this period is, that you can't actually usurp a democratically elected government and then expect everybody else to play by the rules. In particular, Malagasy National Park has been almost completely logged out plundered, largely by Chinese criminal gangs. And that's not a remark about the Chinese, they just happen to be.
Sorry, which park was that?
Malagasy. 20 years of conservation work has gone in a space of 3 months, and you can't really expect it to be otherwise. ANGAP officials have been told very clearly not to intervene, and after they burned down a few houses, the message was read. And as I understand it, the same thing is happening with mining, particularly on the outskirts of the national park in the north, where there have always been a few little illegal mines, and they're now letting rip. I can't help being slightly paranoid and wondering whether it's an accident that Rajoelina signed a contract with Total for exploitation of the oil reserves that, in fact, Mobile Exxon had been excavating. But maybe I'm feeling paranoid.
Well, I mean, yes, I mean, this sort of situation indeed is, you do get a certain amount of plundering when there's no clear, it's not clear who's really in charge, and there's, you know, power is up for grabs, of course. I think, you know, I mean, Madagascar's a country, but, you know, because it's an island, it was a French colony, and until the late 1970s, I mean, there was a strong feeling that, you know, the only important relationship was with France. And Mr. Ratsirika, President Ratsirika, was a pretty disastrous president. But in some ways, his you know, and he was first of all allied with, like I said, with North Korea and Russia, sent a lot of people to study in Russia. Then the country was bankrupt, so he did a deal with the IMF, so he stopped being friends with Russia, and he went. But it did have a rather positive side, which was to, as it were, break out of that unique relationship with France. Now, Mr. Ravalomanana, I can't say he was anti-French, but he was certainly not very friendly to France. He was a favourite of the Bush administration. He was very interested in business opportunities in Asia, and I think he was really trying to multiply business opportunities. So, you know, he certainly upset a certain, you know, a lot of people inside Madagascar. I mean, various business people who had nice deals, many of which they may have had for years, and they had their friends here and there. So, yes, I mean, if you give contracts, it has political repercussions domestically, and it has international repercussions. That's absolutely, that's the law of life, you know. I mean, that's the way it is. But you know, so he, I mean, you know, in retrospect, Mr. Ravalonanana made a lot of mistakes. One of which was, as I said, I mean, really gratuitously insulting France by declaring the French ambassador persona non grata, and particularly for no particularly obvious reason.
Well,
could I ask one controversial question?
As long as it's short.
It's very short. Do people generally think that tourists should be encouraged to go back to Madagascar now?
I've got no idea what Malagasy people think on that score. I mean, they probably would like it because they bring foreign exchange with them, I guess.
I don't know. I think tourism is one of those things that if you do it well, yes, it benefits people and it's a good thing. If it's done badly, it's both socially, environmentally, and probably economically very destructive. I think you can do it well or you can do it badly. Sorry, that sounds a very weaselly answer, but it's actually, I think, where it's at. But with that, I've known Stephen for, I just was thinking as you were talking, we've known each other about 30 years, and I can listen to you for hours.
Oh, thank you very much.
I wish we could stay. You make complicated situations much more simple, and I really appreciate this, and I think we should all thank Stephen very much for his time tonight.